Thank you very much. My mic was on mute. Damn. I'm so glad you said that. That's embarrassing. Yeah, I was muted. Sorry about that. Okay, so we left off talking yesterday about the gorilla. This was a guy who was high up in the Vatican. He was just some kind of goon. Uh, so now we left off talking about, like I said, the gorilla. The next section here is a new bank. Sindona next acquired the Banca di Messina, which gave the Gambino, Inzerillo, and Spatola crime clan unlimited access to a financial firm in Sicily. The Sicilian financier went on to buy a third bank, the Banque de Financement, FinaBank, in Geneva, which was largely owned by the IOR and, like the BPF, used as a conduit to move money out of Italy. Interesting stuff. After Sindona's purchase of the majority interest, the Vatican retained a 29% share based on its awareness of the benefits of owning a Swiss bank for the transfer of laundered funds. Yeah, this is another thing. Like people uh, will argue that like countries in I don't know, I guess like some parts of Europe, Switzerland, because they stay neutral in conflicts, that they are not imperialist, as if they are not like vassals of the empire, like part of it, and they just play a different role. It's like these are the same people who, when you talk about organizing some kind of revolutionary movement, they will say, "Yeah, there's tons of roles for everyone. You can be like a propagandizer. You can just make posters. You can do arts and crafts." While they have like literally no actual revolutionaries or militants, but they can't imagine that like countries could play a role in an empire by providing financial secrecy, money laundering, the kind of like privacy and shrouded money movement that like places like Switzerland offer people. So Hambro and Kennedy, on behalf of their financial firms, gobbled up the remaining shares. The peasant from Padai now emerged as one of the most influential figures within international financial circles. Working with the important Banque de Paris et de Pays Bas, I don't know, I can't do French. I have no idea how you actually say that. Sindona bought controlling interest in Libby, McNeil and Libby Incorporated. Libby, McNeil and Libby, okay. Incorporated, the massive American food processing chain with over 1,300 workers in the Chicago area. Interesting. Okay, so they're getting involved, they're diversifying, getting involved in like the food production industry for some reason, or at least investing. It seems like it's just all financialization, really. So the Chicago connection. Family Jewels, a set of CIA reports recently released under the Freedom of Information Act, shows that Sam Giancana, a mafia capo from Chicago, became one of the agency's underworld agents in the 1960s and one of the pivotal figures in the money laundering process. Members of the Giancana family made deposits in continental Illinois that were transferred to Sindona's banks and enterprises in Liechtenstein and Milan. More money was transported by Giancana's men to Washington, D.C., where it was converted into bonds and forwarded to FinaBank in Geneva. So yeah, this is like part of the money laundering process. Like they literally just bring illicit funds to Washington, they convert those into licit funds, and then send it off into Geneva. It makes you wonder why they even need to go through that step. It's like, shouldn't the financial secrecy of Swiss banks provide you with that level of obscurity that you need? Still more money was transported from Chicago to Mexico in suitcases carried by thugs dressed as Catholic priests. The money was then sent to a string of shell companies in Panama before arriving at the bank. Here we have the Panama connection too. Everyone remembers the Panama Papers, and it's become literally a meme that nothing happened to anyone named in those papers except that the person who exposed it was killed. Throughout this process, the CIA, with the cooperation of Hank Anslinger of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN, worked closely with Archbishop Marcinkus. According to Tully Akampora, a former CIA operative, Hank was so close to Marcinkus that he could get Anslinger's friends an audience with the Pope. Okay, so yeah, some connections in high places, of course. This next section here is called Banking on Losses. Sindona's banking enterprise flourished as billions of dollars from the narcotics trade flowed from Sicily to Switzerland. At the same time, he was learning one of the cardinal rules of theft. The best way to rob a bank is to buy it. Much of the stolen money, however, did not end up in Sindona's wallet or a safe within an Italian-American club in Brooklyn. Used to mount Gladio's strategy of tension and other covert ventures that would erupt in the coming decade, The $22 billion eventually lost by Sindona and his compatriots in their banking ventures seemed to vanish into thin air. Financial analysts to this date remain mystified by the missing money. Few have come to realize that the purpose of acquisition of banks by CIA operatives, including Paul Helliwell, William Colby, Donald Beasley, David Kennedy, and Sindona, was not to produce dividends for shareholders, but rather to chalk up losses in a bewildering array of bogus ventures. So yeah, the point is quite literally to lose money, just to make it confusing so that you can't trace where the money is going. They're still using money for all of their militant and covert operations, all their illicit deeds, but you just can't track it. It also reminds me of that scene in the Sicario movie, the first one, where they investigate that bank. And there's like a woman who's making daily deposits of like $9,000. And they say not only do they not have to report it because it's just under the $10,000 limit of cash deposits that they report, but also they were depositing it into an account that had opened up a huge line of credit. So basically they were paying off debt. So it's a great way to just hide the funds that you're depositing as if it's like something that they just don't look at, apparently. And that's sort of similar to what it seems like they're doing here. Other bankers who shared Gladio's vision of a new world order, created through the dissolution of political ideologies hostile to American capitalism, were willing to have their institutions undergo financial hemorrhages for the cause. Interesting. So they literally are subordinating their own financial interests, at least like their excessive wealth, because I'm sure they're still doing fine. But that's how much it means to them to fight the communists in whatever secret way they can. They will spend billions of dollars from their own companies. They will leverage the financial well-being of their companies over it. David Rockefeller, chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, appears to fall into this category, as suggested by the hundreds of millions of dollars in losses that came from Chase Manhattan's investments in South America at the behest of the CIA. As Gladio emerged into an international operation, the billions from the drug trade proved insufficient to provide for the mounting expenses. While Sindona was purchasing banks with funding from the Mafia, the Vatican, and the CIA, Paul E. Helliwell and Meyer Lansky were setting up Castle Bank and Trust in Miami and the Bahamas. Unlike Sindona's banks, which were used to mount attacks in Italy, Turkey, and Western Europe, Castle Bank and Trust became, quote, the conduit for millions of dollars earmarked by the CIA for the funding of clandestine operations directed at countries in Latin America and the Far East. Cool stuff. Very cool. Yeah, so they also have it seems like they have it kind of divided and delegated among where the different operations are going to take place, and they're funded from different sources. So this next section here is called Spread of the Plague. The appearance of these firms testifies not only to the expanding covert activities of the CIA, but also the enormous growth of the heroin industry. In 1967, the Haight-Ashbury Medical Clinic in San Francisco opened a special section for heroin addicts. Of the addicts served by the clinic, about 25%, classed as, quote, old-style junkies, had first used heroin before January 1964. About 20%, classed as, quote, transitional junkies, first used heroin between then and January 1967. And the remaining 55% or so were, quote, new junkies, who began to use heroin after January 1967. Interesting that they kind of divided it and had them all sectioned off like this, but heroin was also at the heart of the problem that President Nixon cited in 1969, when he laid out a 10-point plan for reducing illegal drug use, an effort for which New York was the proving ground. Quote, New York City alone has records of some 40,000 heroin addicts, and the number rises between 7,000 and 9,000 a year. Nixon wrote in his July 14, 1969 message to Congress, quote, these official statistics are only the tip of an iceberg whose dimensions we can only surmise. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are just not known addicts. I can only imagine how they're arriving at all those numbers anyway. This next section here is Inside Sindona's Bank. Sindona was more than a CIA operative and Vatican financial advisor. He was also a thief. In 1966, Carlo Bordoni, a financier with mafia connections and years of experience in making multi-million-dollar foreign exchange deals, examined the activities at the BPF and was overwhelmed by his discoveries. 12 years later, Bordoni related these discoveries to authorities in Milan from a prison hospital in Caracas. In a sworn affidavit, he wrote, quote, when I started to go to the BPF during the summer of 1966, I was deeply affected by the chaos that reigned in the various sectors. It was a tiny bank that was able to survive only thanks to the margins that emanated, duly masked, of course, from a myriad of, quote, black operations which BPF effected on behalf of Credito Italiano, Banca Commerciale Italiana, and other important national banks. These foreign currency black operations, a vast illegal export of capital, took place daily and large figures were involved. The technique was really the most coarse and criminal which can be imagined. So they're not even like sophisticated at it. He's just describing that this whole thing is a shell game, a Ponzi scheme of sorts, but all reliant on this constant inflow of illegal funds from uh, like illegal drug money, and then sending that off to Gladio operations. Bordoni found a vast number of overdrawn accounts without any real guarantees, and for amounts in far in excess of the legal limit of a fifth of the capital and reserves. He also found massive incidents of theft. The staff at the BPF was transferring large amounts of money from the accounts of depositors without their awareness. These sums were funneled into an account held by the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank, in turn, transferred the amounts, minus a 15% commission, to Sindona's private account at Finobank in Geneva, which was named Mani for his two sons. MA stood for Marco, and I for Nino. It's like using that as your password. It's like my password is your dog's name, 1234, like whatever. If a client at the BPF complained that a check had bounced or that his account should contain more than was listed, he was told to take his business elsewhere. If he continued to complain, a manager would appear and say, quote, "It's simply an accounting error that we shall rectify." If he threatened to contact the authorities, he would spend his last moments, quote, "swimming with the fishes." Okay, so that's the kind of bank they're dealing with here. Wow. Standard operating procedures, the next section here. For Bordoni, the activities at Banca di Financement in Geneva were equally hair-raising. Mario Olivero, the general manager, and other bank managers and IOR officials spent all day playing the stock, commodity, and currency markets. If they lost, the losses were transferred to the accounts of the clients. If they won, they transferred the earnings to their personal accounts. Hilarious. That is fucking fantastic. The Vatican Bank, in addition to owning 29% of the bank, maintained several accounts at the Banca di Financement. Upon investigation, Bordoni discovered that these accounts, quote, reflected exclusively gigantic speculative operations that resulted in colossal losses. Okay, so he's not even being like, what do you call it, like dramatic there. He's not even exaggerating. It's pretty bad. A shell company called Liberfinco, a Liberian financial company, had financed these losses, along with the losses of other major speculative investors. In 1966, at the time of Bordoni's inspection, Liberfinco was displaying a loss of $30 million. In 1973, when Swiss banking officials appeared on the scene, the losses of the shell company had climbed to $45 million. When the Swiss informed Sindona, the Vatican, Continental Illinois, and Hambros that they had 48 hours to close Liberfinco or they would declare Banca di Financement bankrupt, Sindona closed Liberfinco, only to set up Aran Investment of Panama, another shell company, which displayed an instant deficit of $45 million. This is just like, it's like a joke. Like it's just funny how amateurish this stuff is. And they were just able to get away with it, again, because of the connections in the highest places possible. After uncovering such shenanigans in Sindona's banks, Bordoni tried to distance himself from his employer. Sindona responded by a tried-and-true business technique of P2 and the Mafia, blackmail. Bordoni had broken the law in his own foreign speculations. Sindona threatened not only to report these transgressions to the Bank of Italy, but also to use his powerful friends to wreak financial destruction upon his colleague's family. "You will never be a real banker," Sindona said, "because not only are you unable to lie, you are also a man with principles." Duly humbled, Bordoni stayed and assisted Sindona in the formation and operation of a massive international brokerage company called Moneyrex. See, he turned him from a critic and a potential adversary who was going to blow up the whole thing into an ally, just with blackmail. He had no other choice. To report Sindona's crimes would constitute an exercise in futility. Sindona was much more than a made man. He was wired to Italy's most powerful business and political officials. Let me see how far I am along in time here. So I'll go for a few more minutes. Yeah. So the next section here is the Money King. Created in 1964, MoneyRex established relations with 850 client banks throughout the world and conducted business in excesses of $200 billion a year. Through his brokerage firm, Italy's richest and most powerful individuals could squirrel away enormous fortunes illegally and safely in foreign banks. Sindona performed this service for a commission that fluctuated between 15 to 20%. He also kept a private ledger that incriminated his, quote, confidential clients. This list would serve as his lifesaver when his bloated corporate vessel sank. In June 1967, Internal Revenue Service agents became aware that Sindona was involved in the drug trafficking of the Gambino Inzerillo Spatola clan. The case came to center not on heroin, but, quote, the illicit movement of depressant, stimulant, and hallucinogenic drugs between Italy, the United States, and possibly other European countries. But the investigation, thanks to the CIA's intervention, I was going to say, like, why would the IRS even get wind of this, let alone form some kind of investigation or carry it out into any kind of like conclusion? So here, obviously, they did not. But the investigation, thanks to the CIA's intervention, came to a dead end. Of course, you should expect nothing else. What else could possibly happen? This next section here, Sindona and Saigon. Southeast Asia continued to remain of critical importance to the global narcotics market. Sindona developed a friendship with Chiang Kai-shek and members of the general's family. On several occasions, he traveled to Formosa to provide funds to Chiang and the remnants of the KMT, who continued to cultivate the poppy fields of Laos and Thailand with members of the Hmong people. In 1967, CIA operatives Theodore Shackley and Thomas G. Kleins were assigned to establish heroin refineries with the aid of the Corsican mafia, who permeated Saigon's underworld. Yeah, I remember there was also like quite a technical process that went into refining this heroin, and I can't remember who they said was like unable to do it. I thought it was the Italians who were unable to. So maybe by this time they've actually learned. In 1968, Shackley, known as the Blonde Ghost, arranged for Santo Trafficante Jr. to visit Saigon and meet with drug lord Vang Pao in the Continental Palace Hotel. The meeting concerned Vang's ability to provide the supply for the ever-increasing demand. During his stay, Trafficante also met with prominent Corsican gangsters to assure them of increased shipments to the laboratories in Marseille. So yeah, we've got the French mob, we've got the American mob involved, the Italian mob, we have all these different mafias involved. When the Old Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, BNDD, launched Operation Eagle in 1968, it found itself arresting scores of CIA employees, many of whom were working directly for Trafficante. But although it arrested several of his deputies, the BNDD could not get the Johnson or Nixon administrations to go after Trafficante directly. By 1971, Congress was getting so many complaints about GIs returning home addicted that the BNDD began to investigate. This investigation, too, went nowhere. Womp womp. Yeah, who could imagine? The CIA insisted on loaning some of its select special agents to the BNDD as, quote, investigators. The agents turned out to be the same men who had assisted in setting up the Laotians and Thais in the heroin business in the first place. It's so funny. It's so beyond corrupt. This is the funniest chapter in the book I've read so far. So it's like, yeah, it's beyond funny. I don't have any other comment about it. Like, what else can you do but laugh? Next section here, a papal problem. 1969 proved to be a banner year for Sindona. He stood as the most powerful financial figure in Italy. The Gruppo Sindona included 6 banks, the international CIGA hotel chain, and 500 other companies. He controlled the stock market in Milan, where 40% of the shares traded on any given day were under his control. Insane levels of power. Let's see. His ability to influence Italy's financial condition was so profound that former Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, a former member of P2, proclaimed him, quote, the savior of the lira. In the spring of that year, Sindona was summoned late at night to the Pope's private study on the 4th floor of the Apostolic Palace. The short, slender, and well-spoken mafia don wore a meticulously tailored navy blue suit, a white shirt with gold cufflinks, and a gray silk tie. He appeared fresh and confident. The Pope was seated in one of his satin-covered chairs. His body was bent forward, and he appeared tired and ill. The Holy Father did not offer his ring for Michele to kiss. Instead, they greeted each other with the handshake of old friends. Quote, "There is a terrible problem," Paul VI told Sindona. He was referring to the collapse of the quote, First Republic and the long reign of the Christian Democratic Party. The new government had moved to discard the Lateran Treaty of 1929 and the tax-exempt status of Catholic holdings throughout the country. The measure spelled financial destitution for the church and an annual tax bill in excess of $250 million. Even worse, the measure could prompt other countries to follow suit, leaving the Holy Mother Church stripped naked of her vast wealth. Quote, "No matter," the Pope said, "is of greater importance." Sindona replied by proposing a strategy to move Vatican resources out of Italy into the United States and tax-free euro-dollar market through a network of offshore financial firms. This move would not only cloak the Vatican's holdings in omerta, a quality the Holy See valued as much as the mafia, but it would also demonstrate to other countries that the Roman Catholic Church was financially powerful and that any interference with the Vatican's finances could produce dire consequences for national economies. Yeah, killing two birds with one stone there. I'm going to guess that they were successfully able to do that. I'm going to bookmark it here. I'm going to type it correctly, sorry. And then I'm going to switch over to now the Western Marxism book. But I'll leave off the Gladio book just with saying that the only reason we know about most of the things in that book is because of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal. And that was when, most of it was like some kind of corruption scandal in the Banco Ambrosiano. And because of that, they were able to get a hold of the roster, like the list of all the people who were members of the P2 Masonic Lodge, which was like the center for all this corruption in Italian politics. And then that started to blow up in the entire scandal. But we haven't quite gotten there yet in the book. So now moving on to Western Marxism. Again, this is the Domenico Losurdo book, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So the demarcation line between the two, this is Western and Eastern Marxism. The demarcation line between the two is not to be understood as merely geographic, since, as we know, not a few of the Bolshevik leaders came from the West. And it is in polemics against two of them, Parabellum by Radek and Kievsky by Platikov, that Lenin made clear his position. Or maybe it's not by those, but it's about those people. The division of nations into oppressor and oppressed forms the essence of imperialism, and the struggle for overcoming it must constitute the principal question of the revolutionary program. This division is most significant from the angle of the revolutionary struggle against imperialism. To reiterate and make official this point of view, in the summer of 1920, the Congress of the Peoples of the East took place in Baku, immediately after the Second Congress of the Communist International. It felt the need to modify the slogan that concludes the manifesto of the Communist Party and the inaugural address of the Workingmen's International. The new slogan went, quote, "Proletarians of all countries and oppressed peoples of the entire world, unite." Now, alongside proletarians were also the oppressed peoples, emerging as a revolutionary subject in their own right. Awareness grew that the class struggle was not only the proletarian struggle in the capitalist metropolises, but also that waged by the oppressed peoples of the colonies and semi-colonies. And it would be, above all, this latter type of class struggle that would define the 20th century. Damn right, yeah. The October Revolution had come to power, launching an appeal to the West to make the socialist revolution, and one to the East to make the anti-colonial revolution. The latter, therefore, was never lost sight of, and within a short time, assumed an unexpected centrality, one looked on with suspicion by Western Marxism. I mean, that really is the case. That is like the story of the last century or so, is that the anti-colonial struggle, that version of Marxism, kept fighting, kept actually waging war against the oppressors, whereas the Western so-called real revolutionary Marxism has retreated into academia. So his next section here is the national and colonial question in the heart of empire. For all intents and purposes, the colonial and national question emerged with a force reaching beyond the colonial world. On this point, also Lenin showed himself to be extraordinarily lucid. We have already seen him hinting at the gathering storm over Eastern Europe. There is more. In July 1916, after having seen the armies of Wilhelm II advance to the gates of Paris, the great revolutionary reiterated the imperialist nature of the First World War, then underway, and called attention to a possible overturning. If the gigantic conflict were to end, quote, in victories similar to those achieved by Napoleon, in the subjugation of a whole series of nation states capable of independent life, then a great national war in Europe would be possible. In this context, it is useful to reread an important passage in Lenin's essay, Analyzing Imperialism, whose character was such that it, quote, strives to annex not only agrarian territories, but even most highly industrialized regions, if only to weaken its adversary. The imperialist competition for world hegemony knew no boundaries. However industrialized or ancient its civilization, no country was sheltered from the risk of seeing itself transformed into a colony or semi-colony. Not even the colonialist and imperialist powers could consider themselves safe. After the victories, quote, similar to those achieved by Napoleon, won by Hitler in the spring of 1940, France became a colony or semi-colony of the Third Reich. It is interesting to note that even before coming to power, Hitler proposed a racialization of the French people, relegating them among the colonial peoples and inferior races. Yeah, I mean, people should also keep in mind that race is fictional. Race is made up. It's like literally a social construct. Because of that, you can bend that definition however you like. People who use race to drive their politics, to drive their militant war efforts, whatever, they can change that definition whenever and however they like because it is made up to begin with. But continuing with the book here, France did not truly belong to the world's white community. It was on the road to, quote, Negroization. Vernigerung is the German word, I guess. France did not protect itself in any way from interracial marriages and sexual relationships, and so shamelessly, quote, Negroized its blood. So, this is, of course, the Nazi theory. So advanced was this ruinous process that, quote, France is racially becoming more and more Negroid. So much so that now one can actually speak of the creation of an African state on European soil, indeed a Euro-African mulatto state. And pardon me if any of those things are slurs. I don't know how bad the M word is. Driven from the colonial world, the French were forced to carry out a national and anti-colonial revolution to recover their independence and national dignity. What was happening in Italy was perhaps more significant. Mussolini entered the Second World War voicing explicitly imperialist slogans, conquering a place in the sun, the return of the empire, quote, on the fatal hills of Rome, etc. When he fell, Mussolini left the country not only prostrate and broken, but also in large part controlled by an army that acted like an army of occupation, and that considered and treated the local population as a colonial people, members of an inferior race. The diary entries of Goebbels for September 11th, 1943 are revealing. Quote, the Italians, by their infidelity and treachery, have lost every claim to a national state of the modern type. See, this is the thing. Fascists always betray their own people. Like, it quite literally is a death cult. You cannot trust them. They had to be punished, going back to the Goebbels quote here, they had to be punished most severely, as the laws of history demand, end quote. In effect, in the eyes of the Nazis' bosses, the Italians were by now, quote, Negroid, and so it was important to avoid sexual contamination. And they're fucking obsessed. Like, if it isn't clear that the whole fascist ideology is quite literally just like sexual insecurity and like low IQ cope to deal with like the reality that Marxism is correct, like even from their own writings and the things that they say and do, like they're obsessed with like preventing people from having sex. Like, you're going to prevent race mixing by outlawing it. Like, after the war, they were to be utilized as a more or less servile labor force, which is also funny too, because like all the anti-Semites and fascists accuse Jewish people of thinking this way about everyone else, of thinking that they're inferior and therefore ready, like just ready for enslavement, and that that's justifiable. And they literally think this about their own comrades, like their own people. So after the war, they were to be utilized as a more or less servile labor force, quote, workers at the service of the Germans. Having participated in the unleashing of an imperialist war for the conquest of colonies in Africa and the Balkans, Italy found itself having to conduct a national liberation war to throw off the colonial yoke imposed by the ex-ally and recover their own national independence and national dignity. And again, just like reiterating that the entire thing about the Nazi fascists attempt at empire was to try and catch up with the rest of the other colonialists. And because they were the latest ones and they did it to other Europeans, they get the bad rap, and the rest of the colonialists get away with not being perceived as just as bad as the Nazis, even though they were. Again, because their victims were brown and far away. In conclusion, as in part foreseen by Lenin, in the heart of Europe, far from being, quote, only proletarian, the revolution ended up being anti-colonial and national. Section 3 here. The socialist countries in the epoch of Napoleonic Wars. At least as far as Soviet Russia was concerned, was the contradiction socialism and capitalism, or proletariat and bourgeoisie, unequivocally the principal one? While Lenin tried to convince his party comrades of the need to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, regardless of how humiliating it was, between February and March 1918, he observed, quote, another epoch may, like the epoch of the Napoleonic Wars, be an epoch of liberation wars, not one war, but wars, imposed by aggressors upon Soviet Russia. If this scenario were to be realized, the Bolsheviks would first have had to struggle for national independence. In that case, for the country of the Socialist October Revolution, neither socialism and capitalism nor proletariat bourgeoisie would have been the principal contradiction, and such a situation would have lasted for an entire epoch. What concrete form would the struggle between Napoleonism and anti-Napoleonism have taken? At the end of the Second World War, it was clear that the Third Reich had conducted its campaign in the East in a different frame of mind than it did in the West. The advance in the East had racial and colonial overtones. At least for the most ultra-Nazi circles, it was about driving Russia back within borders before those established by Peter the Great, and opening an enormous area for German and colonial and semi-colonial domination. Did the threat of colonial domination come from only one direction? Between the February and October revolutions, Stalin denounced the Entente, which sought to force Russia to continue fighting and furnish resources and cannon fodder for the great Western powers. The latter sought to transform the great European and Asian country through, quote, the conversion of Russia into a colony of Britain, America, and France. Not by chance did they behave in Russia as if they were, quote, in Central Africa. So yeah, I mean, people don't tend to think of it in modern day terms, but like, Russophobia is a real thing, and it really does color the way that people see geopolitical events. They see the motivations of like Russia as being like underhanded. They can't possibly see them as other human beings who also want to live and exist and like deserve that. So everything that like Russia does, everything that Russia as a country, like their administration of government or any of the representatives say, they immediately distrust as if like all Russians are underhanded and untrustworthy. And this literally goes back to this blatant racism. It's hundreds of years old. In effect, compared with the country born of the October Revolution, a frankly racist attitude was widespread among the dominant classes in the West. Could the country governed by those barbarians and savages that were the Bolsheviks still be considered an integral part of the community of civilized peoples and of the white race? Yeah, they're just blatantly fucking racist. In denouncing the, quote, rising tide of the colored people, in a book that was extraordinarily successful on both sides of the Atlantic, a U.S. writer handed down an irrevocable judgment. By inciting the revolt of the colonial peoples, Bolshevism must be considered and treated, quote, as the renegade, the traitor within the gates, who would betray the citadel, as the mortal enemy of civilization and the white race. It's almost like the only people who are anti-communist are white supremacists and racist, and they don't admit it themselves, they just are that. Oswald Spengler in Germany took up this thesis. By becoming Soviet, Russia had thrown away its, quote, white mask to, quote, once again become Asiatic. Oh no. Indeed, quote, Mongolian. Not that. Anything but being Asian. It has, quote, instilled into the whole of the Earth's colored population a hatred toward the white nations. Really, Bolshevism did that? Not the white nations' own actions and colonialism on the rest of the world? Not their genocides? Not their, like, mass atrocities? It was Bolshevism that did this? On January 27, 1932, addressing the industrialists of Dusseldorf and all of Germany, and gaining their definitive support for his rise to power, Hitler made clear his vision of history and politics. During the 19th century, the, quote, white peoples had conquered an unprecedented dominion, concluding a process that had begun with the conquest of America and developing further under the banner of, quote, absolute, innate sovereign sentiment of the white race. By questioning the colonial system and provoking or aggravating the quote confusion of European white thought, Bolshevism was a mortal danger to civilization. If one wanted to confront that threat, it was necessary to reiterate in theory and practice the quote conviction of the superiority and therefore of the superior right of the white race. It was necessary to defend quote this economic superiority over the rest of the world. Yeah, fascism is a purely colonial project inherently. It is perfectly in line with the so-called democratic international order of colonialism and neocolonialism, which is why that order, as it is breaking down, is reverting to more and more overt fascism. So with clarity, a program of colonialist and pro-slavery counter-revolution was announced. The necessary reaffirmation of the planetary dominance of the white race presupposes the assimilation of the fundamental lesson that arises from the history of colonial expansion of the West. One must not hesitate to have recourse to the quote brutal ruthlessness required by the quote right to organize the rest of the world. This is from Herrenrecht. These were the assumptions of barbaric aggression on which Nazi Germany sought to build in Western Europe its colonial empire, enslaving the quote indigenous, that is, the Slavs, seen as an inferior race, good only for servile labor. Checkmating this project was the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, born of industrialization conducted as a forced march and at a terrible human and social cost. If this is how things were, was Soviet Russia's priority to build a new social order, or was it defending itself from the dangers of colonial subjection? Was it necessary to profoundly rethink and redesign social relations, or to undertake the development of the productive forces and the growth of industrial and military production in particular? In the workplaces and the battlefields, did an appeal have to be made to a specific class, the proletariat, or the nation as a whole, given that what was at stake was the defense of national independence? Yeah, I mean, so much of the criticisms of earlier Soviet Russia that people idealistically level at Soviet Russia, it's like they don't understand the conditions they were in. Like, if you were in quite literally an existential struggle as a country, you're going to have to make some concessions, and you're not going to be the ideal socialist utopia, obviously. But people don't like to hear that. Let's see how much more time I can go on with this one. Okay, a couple more minutes in this book, and then I'll bookmark it. Schivel says, was the Bolsheviks a multi-ethnic group based under the principles of proletarian struggle? Yeah, it's almost like that's their whole mission, right? Other countries that underwent socialist revolutions faced analogous considerations. In China, the liberated areas governed by the Communist Party, which had sprung up from the retreat to the countryside, made necessary by the disastrous defeat of the Workers' Revolution of 1927 in Shanghai, were forced to take note of the colonial expansionism of the Empire of the Rising Sun. Beginning in 1937, with a large-scale invasion by the Tokyo government, the struggle against colonialism ended up overwhelming every aspect of political life, to the point that Mao Zedong, under those circumstances, theorized, quote, the identity between the national struggle and the class struggle. This identity governed the war of resistance against Japanese imperialism, a war of direct resistance led by the Communist Party to save the entire Chinese nation from the enslavement that the Empire of the Rising Sun sought to impose upon it. It's still just so wild to think of, like, Japan being this, like, such a small country, and then trying to literally colonize China. And then because they had so many allies in the West, obviously like Nazi Germany, and then like the Western powers just like leaving them to do it, because China had to fight Japan for like at least 4 years with no help whatsoever. Yeah, obviously the Western powers were perfectly happy to let Japan wage war against the communists, because they didn't particularly like them either. Yeah, it's just so wild to think of the circumstances. In conclusion, the historical chapter that began with the October Revolution saw the emergence of socialist countries grappling with aggression, or the threat of aggression, and with an epoch of Napoleonic wars imposed by imperialist powers. It was an objective situation that made secondary the problem of building a socialist or communist society. There took place what we might call a turning point in the turning point of the 20th century. The epochal importance of the October Revolution must be clear to all. Yet, while the public debate and the political struggle seemed entirely to regard the dilemma between capitalism and socialism, there intervened, unnoticed by many, an entirely unexpected phenomenon. It became progressively clearer that the colonial question would play an essential role even in the socialist countries born of the October Revolution. We can now better understand why the hopes initially aroused by the revolution were not realized. The development of the objective contradictions placed as the order of the day, and on a worldwide scale, the conflict between imperialism and anti-imperialism, and between colonialism and anti-colonialism. And this conflict continued to take priority even if it was communist forces sustaining the cause of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism that held firm to this political orientation. Yeah, you really have no choice but to operate in reality. You can claim whatever ideals you like, but you're still in the real world dealing with physical matter at the end of the day. The great historical crisis of the first half of the 20th century ended with the defeat inflicted on Hitler's plan to build his colonial empire in Eastern Europe. So ended what has been called the, quote, greatest colonial war in history. This definition is 100% correct if we add a small amendment. It is one of the two greatest colonial wars in history, the other being that which ended with the defeat of the Empire of the Rising Sun, which had sought to emulate in Asia what Hitler was doing in Eastern Europe. Therefore, the revolutionary cycle that began in October 1917 ended with two gigantic national wars, the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union and the War of National Resistance against Japanese imperialism fought by China. Not only was a barbaric, colonialist, and pro-slavery counter-revolution defeated, but the World Anti-Colonialist Revolution was born, which marked the 20th century and would put an end to a world system that had lasted for more than a century under the banner of the most illiberal and oppressive forces. All this counted for little in the eyes of those who, above all in the West, awaited the abolition of the state or the coming of a, quote, new man, to use an expression from The Spirit of Utopia by Ernst Bloch. Yeah, Spirit of Utopia. That's such a fitting title for someone who quite literally had idealist and utopian ideas about what socialism would be, spoken from his comfortable place of privilege in the colonialist West. So I'm going to bookmark that one here. And now we can switch over to the third book for the day. That is Drugs, Oil, and War by Peter Dale Scott. Peter Dale Scott, again, like the inventor of the term parapolitics. And I think he coined something similar to the deep state. I'm trying to remember that now. Excuse me. All right, so now on to this. I think we're still in the introduction here. Although other senators and congressmen were involved, the key instigator was a Democrat, Representative Charles Wilson, associated with the American Security Council. In the fall of 1983, Representative Charles Wilson, Democrat of Texas, started a campaign to supply the guerrillas with a more effective anti-aircraft weapon. Again, this is talking about the guerrillas fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, and they were giving them Stinger missiles, and it was kind of debated whether this was the thing that turned the tide in Afghanistan's favor. Quote, opposition to the Stinger was so great that we had to settle for something less than a missile, he said, recalling that even William J. Casey, the director of Central Intelligence, would not push for Stingers. At the end of 1983, Mr. Wilson persuaded his colleagues to provide $40 million for weapons, and much of it went for a powerful 20-millimeter anti-aircraft gun made by a Swiss company, Oerlikon. The guerrillas began to get the automatic cannon in late 1984, Mr. Wilson said in an interview. For several months, conservative groups had harshly criticized John N. McMahon, who was Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, on the ground that he was blocking efforts to send Stingers to the guerrillas. In early March 1986, Mr. Reagan approved delivery of such missiles. At about the same time, Mr. McMahon, who had served 35 years with the agency, resigned for what he described as, quote, personal reasons. He said his resignation was not, quote, an expression of discontent with the president's policies. So I guess we're supposed to believe that that's actually not the case. But it's weird because also what was mentioned in the reading from yesterday was that the Stinger missiles were not actually the thing that changed the course of that conflict. From an archival historian's perspective discussed below, the decision to provide Stingers in 1986 flowed from National Security Decision Directive 166 of March 1985, signed as President Reagan looked beyond support to victory in Afghanistan. Clearly, however, the momentum shifted in 1983 to 84, when U.S. covert military aid to the Afghan rebels, until then stable in the level of $30 to $35 million annually, more than doubled. The final 1986 Stinger decision was an outgrowth of congressional lobbying in the pre-1985 period, lobbying by the same kind of interests who would lobby later for Colombia and had lobbied earlier for Vietnam. One such interest was the American Security Council, which took an active interest in lobbying for an increased effort in Vietnam in the 1960s and in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Charles Wilson himself was a member of the American Security Council Task Force on Central America. So I've never seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, but I'm pretty sure that's Tom Hanks, right? And so it makes me wonder if that is just like either like blaming some like covert operations and some shady stuff on Charlie Wilson entirely, or even worse, it's just like a hagiography, like I don't know, like a what do you call it, like a lionizing of this guy for 2 hours, where they just make him seem like a hero. Either one is shitty. It's bad enough to just blame a whole bunch of like systemic and like quite literally organizational level illicit drug trades on one dude. But it'd also be worse just to wash all that under the rug and just say this guy was a hero for freedom and democracy. I don't think I want to know. An ASC staff member, Odile English. What kind of name is that? Odile. An ASC staff member, Odile English, toured Afghanistan several times in the 1980s before becoming the PR director for the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, and more recently, lobbyist for the Northern Alliance. The chair of the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, Major General Milner Roberts, retired, was vice president of the ASC. Okay. So all the climbers in the military. The darker side of covert assets. The next section here. A more dubious, quote, deeper influence was Farhad Azima, a contributor to both political parties. As we shall see, Azima's airline, Global International Airways, became involved in the 1980s. In the 1980s, U.S. arms pipeline to Afghanistan. It was also part of a complex of CIA-linked contract cargo airlines that included Air America in Vietnam, Southern Air Transport doing business with the Contras and in Colombia, and Azima's Race Aviation, flying U.S. arms to Iran. Azima founded Global International in 1978. With money borrowed from an Arabian international bank, Global International quickly became one of the nation's largest charter airlines. An FBI agent told author Pete Bruton that sometime global flights, quote, had munitions and arms going out and narcotics coming in. And again, this is like another book where there are numbers indicating footnotes after almost every sentence. So this is not like speculation. This is not somebody making up conspiracy theories. This is all stuff that we know from FOIA documents, from declassified documents. Like this is all here in black and white for anyone who feels like looking at the sources. We have the documents, folks. Azima also had a contract for Global to fly junkets for high rollers to the Dunes Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Furthermore, Azima allegedly sponsored a loan to the Dunes from the mob-controlled Indian Springs State Bank in Kansas City, where Azima himself had... it just kind of cuts off there. This apparent digression into trails leading from covert operations to political influence and ultimately drug airlines and mob-controlled banks is the story that I first explored in, quote, in The War Conspiracy. There must be another book by Peter Dale Scott. And again, with respect to the Contras, in Cocaine Politics. CIA involvement with drug airlines shocked even an aide to Oliver. Who's Oliver? Is that who we just mentioned? This story is not one that I fully understand, but essentially the same lobbies and their milieus, with oil prominent at the overt level, and mob and drug links at the deeper covert level, play recurring roles. For example, there is a striking continuity between the activities of Paul Hellowell. Oh look, he comes up from our Gladio book. The OSS veteran and eventual CIA officer who was counsel to Meyer Lansky's bank, who arranged for civil air transport, later Air America, to become a CIA proprietary, and the succession of later banks with CIA, drug, and mob connections. Castle Bank of the Bahamas, a Hellowell creation, the World Finance Corporation, the Nugan Hand Bank, and most notoriously, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. And it's funny, like reading through this, I also am hearing like a lot of, not surprisingly, names that I hear Aaron Good mention on his show, The American Exception. He's a big fan and influenced by Peter Dale Scott. I'm pretty sure he's read through all of his works. He discusses them all the time. But just to say that that's another great follow-up. If you want to listen to more stuff related to this, go check out the American Exception podcast by Aaron Good. I've also been recently listening to The Empire Never Ended. It's another show, podcast. It's pretty good about these same kind of things, but they're more focused on overt fascist and neo-Nazi groups than the CIA kind of drug smuggling and parapolitics thing. So that's The Empire Never Ended and The American Exception. Unscrupulous individuals and groups can make fortunes through supplying covert operations. Richard Secord of Iran-Contra fame, a Nugan-Hand client, first made millions with Farhad Azima Global International, delivering arms to Egypt through Secord's company, EATSCO, EATSCO. Secord made more money by negotiating Iran-Contra arms deals to Iran, in company with David Kimchi of Israel's Mossad. Man, they're even stealing the name of the Korean food for his last name. One shipment of 23 tons was flown in July 1986. Was flown in July 1986 by Azima's Madrid airline, Race Aviation. So it's just RAC. I don't know what that stands for, but finally in 1992, Secord and Kimchi were reportedly in Azerbaijan, trying to negotiate the sale of arms from Israel. 1 year later, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, this guy's another infamous person. You cannot read anything about the Mujahideen, Afghanistan, atrocities that happened there without hearing about Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So 1 year later, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the chief drug trafficker among the leaders of the Afghan Mujahideen, was, quote, observed recruiting Afghan mercenaries, i.e. foreign mercenaries trained in Afghanistan, to fight in Azerbaijan against Armenia and its Russian allies. So this next section here, covert operators, lobbies, and oil. The experience of Iran-Contra demonstrated that at least with an oil man like Casey running the CIA, such intrigues could escalate to the level of a U.S. constitutional crisis. They would not normally lead to war. Similarly, the biggest defense expenditure items for strategic weapons and their delivery systems have not led us into wars. Wars have emerged instead in smaller countries of interest to oil companies and their lobbies, but whose names at the time were barely known to most Americans, names like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Kuwait. Nations of Central Asia could play a role in our future, such as, to take a random example, Azerbaijan. Since 1994, Azerbaijan's state oil company has held an $8 billion 30-year contract with BP, Unocal, Exxon, and other foreign oil companies to develop oil fields that may be among the largest in the Caspian Basin. Such forward investments create pressures for U.S. government commitments to secure them, and in this case to secure agreements for the pipelines necessary for financial return. There are recurring allegations that U.S. oil companies, either directly or through cutouts, engage in covert operations. In Colombia, as we shall see, a U.S. security firm working for Occidental Petroleum took part in a Colombian Army military operation, quote, that mistakenly killed 18 civilians. We shall see in Chapter 1 that in the Caspian Basin, the major drug routes are where the oil companies are, as for example in Azerbaijan. Yeah, I don't think any of these things are coincidental. It's cool because this book is basically just picking up where the Gladio book leaves off, very much in the time frame, but also in the content, but then also introduces the oil aspect to it. And you can see it just gets used in the same way as the drug trafficking. It all ends up funding the same corruption. So let's see. The entire Caspian Basin is such an area with additional major insecure U.S. oil investments in Kazakhstan and I've never even heard of this country. Turkmenistan? Is that a typo for Turkmenistan? Unless there's really a place, IBRK-Menistan. Especially since 9/11, we have watched Central Asia receive forward deployments of U.S. troops from Georgia to Kyrgyzstan. Nearly all of these states are unstable and their governments have faced armed opposition. The short-term effect of oil investment is usually to increase instability by encouraging corruption, ostentatious living for a few, and increasingly oppressive dictatorship. Awareness, this just sounds like Dubai, right? Awareness of this instability in turn feeds the demand for irrational but definitive shows of U.S. force, as of this writing in 2002 for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The reasons why the United States has engaged in wars against the Third World have been articulated in terms of high-minded strategy. But before the high-minded papers appear, the energies for involvement have been generated by the interests, and with them, the campaign contributions of private sectors frequently financed by oil, by drugs, or both. This is especially true of U.S. official policies in Asia, where America's two most powerful lobbies, the oil cartels and the pro-Israel lobby, have become so hypertrophied in their continuous opposition to each other that they are now both almost beyond mention in polite public. It is customary to refer to AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, as, quote, the most influential and one of the best organized lobbies in Washington. Again, he's writing this in 2002. This came out in 2003. But AIPAC, though famous for being underreported in the media, is relatively high profile compared to the opposing oil lobbies discussed in this book, such as the Foreign Oil Companies Group. AIPAC works at least partly through Congress. The oil lobbies usually work chiefly in the silent halls of the State Department, National Security Council, and CIA. It has been said that, quote, the oil lobby is in itself a sub-government, with roots planted deep in the soil of the real government. I mean, people say the same thing literally about the CIA. That's what I've been saying for years since I started getting into the Gladio book. It's like this was the foundation of creating the shadow government that actually runs everything, despite what the nominal government does or the parties that change hands. AIPAC and the oil lobby have developed largely in conflict with each other, but occasionally, like this is like the real checks and balances, I guess, is AIPAC versus the oil lobbies. That's hilarious. They have developed largely in conflict with each other, but occasionally their interests converge. In 2002, they have at least two active interests in common. Both favor the current forward projection of U.S. power into Central Asia and a U.S. invasion of Iraq. Okay, so that was the new era. That's when it started after 9/11, when they stopped being counterbalancing forces and they started working together. That explains a lot. Explains pretty much the last 20 years. The conflict of unmentionable special interests going back to World War I has deformed the evolution of U.S. attitudes toward Asia and especially Islam. Well, that's a hell of an understatement, but yeah, that's dead on. To say the least, we should say. Worse, it has deformed the evolution of Asia itself, starting with the artificial national boundaries drawn by the Western powers at Versailles. Western powers love doing that. They love imposing borders on other people. So the next section here is psychological resistance to recognition of deep political intrigue, my bad. I have mentioned elsewhere that the psychological resistance that inhibits frank recognition of the dysfunctional and sometimes even criminal underpinnings of our political establishment. This resistance is particularly acute in the case of U.S. policies in Asia, dominated by the machinations of special interests. I hope to show in part in a particularly sensitive thread, the role of international drug trafficking in influencing U.S. interventions from Vietnam to Afghanistan. I would not apply the term conspiracy to this process, although I did earlier, inspired by my early researches into the KMT, the related airline Air America, the China lobby, and the China lobby's undoubtedly conspiratorial dealings with Richard Nixon in 1968. The word conspiracy inevitably connotes a specific group or cabal, and the arc of my research soon embraced a larger milieu. On the other hand, I encountered among other pro-Vietnam War forces a similar ongoing, even predictable conspiratorial mentality, one that could be counted on to seek to thwart conditions of peace imposed by either presidents or Congress. Events since the publication of my book have amply proved that this mentality is still with us. Violations of law to pursue warlike ends were officially documented in the case of Iran-Contra, which led ultimately, if indirectly, to indictments and guilty pleas. Who actually pled guilty in Iran-Contra? Was it Oliver North and then he just kept getting to operate in politics anyway? I'm not going to stop to Google it now. I'm just going to continue with the book, but feel free to look into it for further study. A decade later, it was discovered that the Pentagon had continued lethal training of so-called elite elements of the Indonesian army that were known to have committed war crimes, despite explicit congressional prohibitions. Such violations of law do not surprise long-term observers of the CIA and the Pentagon. It is part of the culture of these organizations to be impatient at restraints from outside, and part of public American political culture to be shocked and surprised anew at each disclosure. Yeah, that's a great way to say what I've been saying for a long time. It's like people find out the info decades after the fact and then do not make the connection between what is still going on. and they do not put the two together. They do not look at the common motivations and influences. In truth, quote, conspiracy has associations too strong for all of what I am describing, just as alternative words like mentality would be assuredly too weak. But at least in the 1960s, it was necessary to understand that war decisions and actions were not always reached or implemented in conditions of openness and candor, but through deceptions and intrigues outside the sites of policy discussion. We can treat the developing U.S. presence in Colombia as a test to determine whether such conditions still exist. Perhaps instead of the word conspiracy, I should have used the older English word conspiration. By analogy with the word aspiration, this would suggest a collusive mentality per se, rather than any particular group engaged in it. Indeed, it might be more fitting to talk of presidents in a peace conspiration, since major presidential initiatives for peace regularly had to be prepared in conditions of secrecy. Eisenhower's remarks about the quote military-industrial complex, a theme of this book, surprised even his close advisors. Kennedy's June 1963 speech at American University, calling for a greater effort for peace with the Soviet Union, quote, was written in the White House without Pentagon or State Department clearance. When Nixon dispatched Kissinger to meet in Beijing with Zhou Enlai, total secrecy was maintained collusively, with a cover story that Kissinger had retreated to the mountains because of stomach problems. The difference is that such peace conspiration was within the lawful power of traders. The war conspiration, in contrast, repeatedly exhibited efforts going at times beyond the law to resist or frustrate that lawful power. This is an instructive paradox. Presidents have found it necessary to conspire, almost in isolation, for peace, while many cabals have engaged in dysfunctional efforts for war. Yeah, that's wild. Like, everyone sort of thinks of, if you get into like the parapolitics thing, if you've listened to Aaron Good, people kind of already have this impression of Kennedy having been assassinated because he was an enemy of this deep state that had been forming and was exercising even more power while he was in office. The Bay of Pigs, notably, being like the biggest example. But then him saying things like he wanted to negotiate more peace with the Soviet Union, and then supposedly his efforts to like thwart Israel. All these are supposedly reasons that he went against the wrong people and was killed for it. And that's why there's so much mystery surrounding his assassination. But to hear this told from Peter Dale Scott, it seems like that was going back even further to Eisenhower and others. So interesting that they have to resort to these measures to try and get peace, because the people who are really running the show are the ones who are making sure the U.S. is always at war in the interest of white supremacy and colonialism. All right, so I bookmarked that one there. I'm going to wrap it up for the day. I'm at an hour. Today I stopped using, thank you, Shibbles, for pointing out that I had started off the episode muted. I probably would have done like 10 or 20 minutes before I realized if you hadn't said anything. But I also stopped using the boom mic stand. I didn't realize how much noise that made. I actually listened to a bit of a reading hour that I had done. I don't listen to these. I just put them out, and then I don't really like to listen back to myself. I didn't like to do it in the editing process. I don't like it now when I'm not editing these. But I didn't realize how much noise that boom stand was making. So if anybody wants to give me any more feedback or tips on how to make the audio quality better, I'm definitely open to feedback and constructive criticism. All right, you guys, thank you again for joining. I will see you again tomorrow.